Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to attend this hopefully worthwhile session. The White Cliffs of Dover we will encounter on our last port before we head back over to Rotterdam. And of course, they're famous throughout the world. And you may know a bit of information about each of the, a bit of information about the White Cliffs of Dover. And I'm hoping that some of this will allow you to perhaps appreciate sort of what's there, because it really is a magnificent grouping of rocks. This was a painting by Henry Bishop. He did it in 1933, and I just loved the painting. I thought it captured the essence of the White Cliffs of Dover. We're going to be going through the Dover Strait. Here is Dover, and here is Calais, France. And the strait is about 20 miles across, about 32 kilometers across. And on both sides, you'll see the term White Cliffs. And so on both sides of the Dover Strait, we'll have cliffs. So when we're sailing in, take a look to starboard, take a look to port, and you'll see the White Cliffs of both France and of England. The strait is busy. It's a narrow strait, and it's transporting a lot of goods in terms of ships. And so the ships have a narrow passageway, a fairly narrow passageway to navigate. And that's a look at the ships that were passing in this area on a given day. And so you can see that it's a busy place. And so truly one of the crossroads of the world in terms of the shipping industry. When we go into the Strait of Dover, which is part of the English Channel, you can look to France on the one side and England on the other, and indeed you can see both shores as we're moving through. So if you're over in France and look towards England, this is what you can see. You see the White Cliffs of England from France. And you can see the White Cliffs of England check that, you can see the White Cliffs of France from England. This is called the Alabaster Coast, or the La Côte d'Albâtre. And it's can you see in the horizon there, sort of that whitish, and there's clouds over top of that now, but the white coast of France is there. There you can see it a bit better. This picture is taken from Dover. And so if you didn't know any different, how would you distinguish between the white coast of France and the white coast of England? That's the channel, the route of the channel. And primarily the White Cliffs of Dover run from about here up to that arrow up there. The White Cliffs of France are stunningly beautiful. They're very, very vertical, as are the White Cliffs of England. A little beach area only when the tide is out. But in many ways indistinguishable from the White Cliffs of Dover. There's Dover in the background, the harbor that we'll be in. There's a very interesting trail that runs along the top of the White Cliffs of Dover, and I'm going to take you partway on that trail. Maybe to give you some ideas as to what you might want to do when you're in Dover. The white is a rock. It's a limestone type of rock, but it's also known as chalk, as you know. Rocks are falling off the cliff all the time. It's constantly being weathered backwards, eroding. And it is a type of limestone. Now this is not England, this is Kingston, Ontario. And this is one of the outcrops that, as an undergrad, we studied quite a bit of. It's an anticlinal formation, which means the limestone which formed horizontally has been, by pressure, compressed, and sometimes it goes up like this, and sometimes it folds down like this. These are called folds. This one's an anticline, and this one's called a syncline. So that's an anticlinal piece of limestone. And this limestone is formed very simply. It's chemically formed in the oceans, and what basically takes place is you have to combine the two ions that make up the limestone. Limestone is essentially calcium carbonate. This solution here is calcium nitrate. This solution here is sodium carbonate. Both of those solutions contain a solute that is perfectly soluble. That's why both solutions appear perfectly clear and, in this case, colorless. So we have two soluble ions, two soluble compounds being now mixed together. And as soon as they mix together, the calcium ion races for and attacks the carbonate ion. And I don't know if you can see there, but that was the first couple of drops that were added to that beaker. And then as you pour more of the sodium carbonate into the calcium nitrate, you get this formation here. And what takes place is the calcium ions, as soon as they touch the carbonate ions, they form an insoluble precipitate, an insoluble solid. And it will eventually drop down to the bottom of the container. And that is exactly what is happening in the ocean. So calcium ions from weathering of rocks on land and carbonate ions from the same process, and sometimes from ocean solubility, will combine with each other to form this white precipitate, which is known as calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate will then sink to the bottom of the sea or the lake or whatever, and over time can form into limestone rocks. So here we have a picture here of calcium carbonate, and if you dry it out enough, it's a white powder, and if you have considerable depths of it, you can compress it and turn it into a rock. And the rock would look something like this. This is called lithographic limestone. It's very fine-grained limestone, and it's used in the printing industry, and hence the name lithographic. So there's some limestone that's a bit more coarse, and that's called clastic limestone. And that's because it's made up of a bunch of fragments of calcium carbonate, whether they be shells or simply broken pieces of other rock that have been cemented together. So that's another type of limestone, the clastic limestone. And if it contains a lot of fossils, it's known as fossiliferous limestone, which is a form of clastic limestone. So the formation of these cliffs here, which are made of chalk, are done in the same fashion as limestone, but slightly different. So what happens in the formation of the White Cliffs of Dover is that you have waters that are temperate in terms of temperature, and in the photic zone, the region where the light penetrates, you have algae growing. And the algae, which is green, is photosynthetic, and it uses the energy from the light to produce its food, sugar, and then also give off some oxygen. And I'm sure you've been through that photosynthetic process many, many times. But basically, these single-celled algae they drift, they don't have any way of propulsion. They drift with the current, they drift with the waves, therefore they're called plankton. So a plankton is an organism in the sea that drifts with the currents. So those are single-celled algae. And what happens is, as I mentioned, they take in the carbon dioxide and the water, they take in those two compounds, and then magically they produce sugar, and they give off this toxin to them, which is oxygen. The oxygen, of course, has become our sustenance. It bubbles out of the ocean and forms the atmosphere. So these things are oxygen producers, carbon dioxide removers. And why are they doing it? So they can make their own food. So they're making a simple sugar molecule, which they will then link together to form cellulose carbohydrates, starches, what have you. So that's basically the photosynthetic process there summarized. I know you wanted a chemical reaction before we left this journey. And most of you have written that out a number of times with the coefficients 6, 6, 1, and 6. But in green, underneath the arrow, is the word chlorophyll, and that's written underneath the arrow because it's a catalyst. And that is why green plants are green, that's why the algae is green, because it contains abundant chlorophyll, which stimulates the production of sugar from carbon dioxide and water. And then, of course, sunlight energy is required for that process because it's an endothermic process. It needs energy in order to occur. So these algae look something like this at a certain stage in their life. This is one of the most common forms of algae. And often what you just saw there appears in numbers numbering the quadrillions in different parts of the ocean. And this is known as a coccolithophore bloom or an algal bloom. And all of that bloom contains many, many, many of these organisms here, which are shelled algae. The algae have a protective shell growing on top of them. So here's the cell in the cell in the middle, the single-celled algae, and around it you have this shell made of calcium carbonate, which is called a coccolith. The whole thing is collectively called a coccosphere. So you have, terminology is nasty. This is the coccolithophore, this is the coccolith, and the whole thing is a coccosphere. And the term cocco refers to the rounded shape of it. It's a Latin word meaning rounded. If you've heard of streptococcus, it's because the coccus bacteria in your throat is of the rounded form, one of the three possible shapes of bacteria. And these coccoliths come in a variety of shapes. And they're all microscopic. You see the symbol here, 2 microns. And a micron is 1 millionth of a meter, or 1/1000th of a millimeter. And a millimeter, if you took a pen and just tapped it on a piece of paper, the diameter of that dot would be about a millimeter. It's about the width of your baby fingernail. I mean, the thickness of your baby fingernail. The term coccolith and coccolithophore comes from the Greek. Kokos referring to seed, lithos referring to stone or rock, and phoros meaning to carry along. And so what a coccolithophore is doing is carrying its shell along with it, ultimately in the formation of a rock, lithos. So here we have a simple diagram showing the internal part, the algae, the external part, its shell, and the whole thing being the coccosphere. And again, there's a coccolithophore bloom. And this is in the region into which we're going to be sailing. We're going to be sailing right into this port right in here, Torquay, on the first day of our visit to England. So what will happen is the algae inside here will die, it will decompose, become part of the nutrients of the sea, consumed by other organisms, but the shell remains because it's insoluble. And over time, that shell will eventually sink towards the bottom of the ocean. And again, a great variety of shell shapes. These are all taken with an electron microscope. So they are super small. And what will happen is they will collect in great, great numbers on the bottom of the seafloor, and they will literally stack up hundreds of meters thickness. And if you were sort of walking along the sea bottom going through it, it'd be sort of like a sticky mud, not firm, but you could walk through it fairly well, but you'd still know that you were stuck in a slurry of mud. And they break apart, the fragments break apart, which allows them to be compacted more tightly. But even though they get packed tightly, there's still porosity, there's still holes within them. And so you have this grouping here, magnified here, and you can see the pores, which allow water to move through the chalk, even though it seems like it's a pretty solid substance. So when you look at these cliffs now, one can hardly believe it, but the fact is that they're made of these little tiny microscopic organisms that have been compressed by a factor of millions of times. And I think it's quite remarkable that such things exist. Over time, how many tens of millions of years does it take for something like that to occur? When you see the magnitude of the cliffs and the height of the cliffs, you think of the numbers of these coccolithophores that would have lived in order to produce the coccoliths to form this material. And certainly formidable in terms of the height and the quantities that are involved. So when you get a piece of chalk, and this is the chalk that, of course, they used to write on blackboards with, you know how that chalk is very, very soft and able to be broken apart and leave its message behind on a board. So the White Cliffs of Dover have a really neat way of having been formed. First of all, they formed during this time period here, the Cretaceous time period, which is the longest geological period of about 80 million years, from 146 million to about 66 million years ago. It's part of the Mesozoic, and you'll see it's right on top of the Jurassic and the Triassic time periods. And essentially, this is what took place during the early, middle, and late Cretaceous time periods. And so if you look at where England is in this general area here, you'll see that there's just a little bit of land, a lot of water, and a lot of sediment being piled up beside the continents. So the other day I showed some slides showing how the Earth's shape has changed. This one is a little more detailed. It's sort of for your enjoyment, but do try, if you can, to focus on where England is today so you can see sort of what has happened over the last 240 million years. This work was put together by a student of mine who took it from a source which was done by a group of university professors. But I found the whole transition to be quite amazing. So 240 million years ago, the continents were sort of massed together. If you can focus on that area, which is difficult to do because you might be wanting to find your own hometown in amongst here and see when it evolved. But if you can focus on that area, you'll see how England and France evolved over time and how we ended up with the, if you will, with the waters and the rocks that ended up being formed. It's tricky to watch, but nonetheless, we'll see what happens here. Pretty interesting how over a time period lands have formed, right? Lands have disappeared, lands have been submerged, lands have been elevated over time. So there's a lot that's sort of gone on there. So over the course of those 220 million years, England itself has gone through a whole bunch of climate changes, geographical changes, changes in sea level, and great tectonic action working on the lands. And again, we begin. All of these huge cliffs formed during that Cretaceous period, and they began with these little tiny microscopic organisms that ended up forming these massive cliffs. And again, it's sort of stunning to believe that something like that could occur. And it took millions of years for that process to occur. Again, another plume of coccoliths. And these happen around the world. I'm just showing the ones that have occurred around England. And again, there's the algae itself with a photomicrograph of it. And essentially then, this algae is the key to the food chains of the ocean. For they are the primary producers. They're called the autotrophs, auto meaning self and troph referring to food level. So they're able to make their own food by that photosynthetic process. And then they become a source of food for these other small animals that eat them. So they're called, those other organisms are called primary consumers. And then those primary consumers in turn are consumed by large organisms, which are called secondary consumers. And that process continues up the food chain. And so you end up here with an example, let's say, of a herring eating a zooplankton which consumed the algae. But that's what's called a food chain. But when you put a whole bunch of food chains together, you have what's called a food web. And so it's very, very, very interactive. This would be an example of a food chain here. Big fish, smaller fishes, until you end up with the zooplankton and then the algae. So that'd be a food chain. Put a bunch of food chains together and you get a food web. And then in terms of consideration of energy levels in food, the primary producers have to be abundant both in numbers and quantity in order to feed these successive levels of feeding levels. And you remember taking that in biology years and years, decades ago. But anyway, again, we come back to the fundamental component, the algae, that break down over time. Their shells fall to the bottom of the ocean after the algae has died, and then the coccoliths are what remain collecting on the bottom of the ocean. Here's sort of the lifestyle, if you will, of an algae. It's here, and then in order to survive, because all life wants to be it then develops something to protect it, because otherwise it's totally vulnerable. And it's come up with an ingenious method by which they took calcium carbonate, calcium ions and carbonate ions from the sea to form this protective shell, which is known as the coccolith, and you end up with an organism that looks something like this. Mostly shell and algae in the middle. So it's pretty amazing what these little tiny creatures can do. So you go from that to this, with no outside help. That all comes from its absorption of calcium carbonate ions from the sea. And again, that great variety of shapes, all microscopic in size. Again, if you had that little pencil prick on a piece of paper, 150 of these would fit inside that pencil, that little pencil dot. That's how small these characters are. So if you had a coin and you tried to figure out how many of these coccoliths would fit on the surface of the coin, you do a little calculation. And I was actually, these are the little coccoliths here, and had I had more time and less life, I would have covered this entire surface with these coccoliths, but I chose not to do that. But I did the calculation to figure out how many of those could fit on the surface of this coin, and trying to figure how long it would take. Well, did I give you the number? Yeah, sorry. It takes 21 million of those coccoliths to fit on the surface of that coin. If you're from Canada, that's similar in size to a loonie. Now, given the height of these cliffs, in this case 100 meters above sea level, and the rate of growth of the collection at only 0.5 millimeter per 100 years, so these coccoliths are collecting only at a very small rate over time, then one can calculate how long it would take for this 100-meter cliff to form. And based upon that and a compaction factor of 500, you would end up with an answer of about 25 million years. So to form 100 meters of that cliff would take about 25 million years. So that's why geologically things are slow, but over time they get things done. So here we have the coccoliths, and those coccoliths, of course, are what fall to the bottom of the ocean to become this type of sediment that gets broken down and then starts to get fused together but not cemented together. So that the chalk is not fused, is not cemented together, but instead it's simply put together and held together by simply gravitational force of electrostatic attractions. And sedimentary rocks are found and formed under the water in horizontal layers. And so what happens is when you get a layer down here, layers build up on top of it, and that pressure is what, in the case of the chalk, fused the chalk together to form the chalk rock we have today. And then you need something to get that from underneath the ocean, those layers underneath the ocean, up above sea level. And in this case of the White Cliffs of Dover, it was the formation of the Alps in Europe about 20 million years ago that ended up pushing these rocks above sea level. And in those diagrams I showed before, the maps, you can sort of see that very quickly, and I'll review that with you in a second. But anyway, so what is chalk? It's a very soft sedimentary rock, and of course it's now being exposed above sea level. And as soon as it gets exposed above sea level, things start happening. It starts getting weathered, the cliff starts to fall apart. And that process is continuing today, and it happens every day. Pieces of the white cliffs fall off and then are lost from the cliff face. And the same thing is happening over in France. So here we have England, and here we have France. But you can see how similar they are. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine you're on the top of that cliff, and at one time, that top of the cliff could have been joined to this top of the cliff. And indeed, that's what has happened. So if we go back to a couple of those maps that were just began 30 million years ago, if you take a look at England here, it's under the southern coast is pretty much exposed, but there's a lot of water around it. And then, can you see here how it's fused? So the water levels have dropped about, here the Alps being constructed, the Alps are pushed up in this direction, which is going to elevate this land area in here connecting England to Europe. Here again the Alps, and here again this pushing up of the chalk layers. And then eventually, as you can see, England separates from Europe. And that happened about 10 million years ago. And what took place? This, essentially. This was the land bridge that was connecting France to England, made of chalk. And as sea levels rose, the waters from the north part started to flow over top, much like Niagara Falls, over top of these soft chalk rocks. But because the chalk is so soft, it was very quickly weathered out by the movement of the water. And as a result of that, you had these huge plunge pools where the water was cascading downwards, carrying material with it. And if you look at a profile of the English Channel, you can see places that are called plunge pools here and here, where the waters from that huge waterfalls of 10 million years ago formed those huge plunge pools. So there's evidence that this is definitely happening. But can you imagine? So England and France joined, and then over the course of a few 100,000 years, the cliffs were worn out by this massive inundation of fast-moving water. And so that's why today the chalk cliffs of Dover are separated from the alabaster rocks of France. Now, this happened in 2012. There was a serious landslide of the chalk on the English side, and that happens quite often. And so now when you look at those cliffs, we realize that they have been eroded and that they're also being weathered continually on a regular basis. And that's what gives them the various shapes that they have. And again, you look at, and here I've just made a small diagram of it, but every time I look at those, I realize and remember that it's actually formed. All these massive cliffs are formed from a small microscopic coccoliths. So there we have the White Cliffs of Dover. Now, we're going to go on a little hike. So 5 kilometers to the southwest of Dover and 12 kilometers northeast are the White Cliffs of Dover officially, and there's a nice hiking trail all along the coast. If you were coming in by ferry from France, this is what you would see. And if you decide to go for a hike, you're up on top of these cliffs, hiking along. And so the trail follows close to the cliff edge, and it passes by a number of interesting little sites as we go. But you notice here that the trail was right along the cliff edge and that part fell off. So the trail has been regrown, if you will, over here. Now, along the trail, you come to this here, which is known as the Fan Bay Deep Shelter. And it was used during the Second World War as a military position for storing weapons, as well as for detecting the presence of enemy aircraft. And that's where it's located. It's not very far from Dover at all. And you can go on a tour through there if you so choose. But the neat thing about that for me is, of course, seeing the fossils in the roof and the sides of the chalk. Now this here is what's called a mirror, and what would happen is the sound of the enemy planes would come in, it would be amplified by this, and then the British would know that the enemy aircraft were approaching sooner than they could visually. Anyway, you continue along the Cliffs Trail, and there are a couple places where you can get down to the sea to walk along the shore. You're moving towards the lighthouse at South Foreland. And again, within easy walking distance from Dover. And this shore is not very welcoming because the tide moves right up against the base of the cliffs, but if you want to get down there, you can do that. So right here is one of the access routes to get down to the beach. It's called Langdon Beach and the Langdon Steps. And you just hike down the steps to the beach area. And you look down and you see one of 2 wrecks that are along the shores of the White Cliffs of Dover. So here's Langdon Beach, here's the Fan Bay Deep Shelter, and there's the lighthouse. Now if you continue past the lighthouse, then it takes you to an interesting location, St. Margaret's Bay. And St. Margaret's Bay is pretty famous. Its houses are down at water level plus up on the cliffs. And you can see that those that are on the cliff are quite precarious. It's a beautiful little beach area. And if you're a fan of James Bond, this is where Ian Fleming lived and when he wrote Moonraker. And much of the shooting of Moonraker was done along this particular piece of waterfront. And in March 2013, here's James Bond creator Ian Fleming's house. There's a landslide. That's about 200 meters away, if that. So weathering is continually occurring. It's one of the processes that's a natural process that's taken its toll on the cliffs. We go from St. Margaret's Bay, and I couldn't resist this because I pretend that I know how to play golf. And so I saw this and I thought, irresistible. If I can get there, and if I can even get a putter and a chipper wedge, I could do some practice, but I'd love to play there. My dilemma is that some of the holes are too close to the cliff and I'd lose a lot of balls. But what a neat location for a golf course. So if you're looking for something to do and you're a golfer, that might be a consideration. Now, the cliffs of Dover are absolutely beautiful. And when you look at these pictures here, you say, oh my, how lovely that is. But you haven't seen those pictures before associated with Dover for a reason. And that's because these pictures have appeared in catalogs advertising the White Cliffs of Dover, as was this one here. The only problem is, it's not at Dover, and it's not part of the White Cliffs of Dover. Instead, it's in this area here. Now, where is that? Well, here's our map of England and part of Europe. That's where that was taken. So this shot here is right here. And of which significance is that for us? Well, that's where we're going to drop in on our first day visit to England. So this here, this is known as the Jurassic Coast or the Fossil Coast of England. And our birthing area is here in Torgay, and it's about 25 miles over to the beginning of this coastline I'm going to show you, the Dorset Coast. So here we are at Torgay, and if you want to get over, I'd like to start right up here. You can't see that, but that's called Lyme Regis, and you'll see the importance of that in just a second. So these are the White Cliffs of Dorset. Now, what do they look like from the air? They're pretty formidable. They're very serious cliffs, but you notice already a different texture or color to them because they're not blank white. There's some of them that are quite white, but they're mostly grayish, and that's because the nature of the rock is different from the White Cliffs of Dover. These are limestone shales, a bit of sandstone thrown in, and a bit of chalk. Now, if you walk along this particular area, there's some really interesting parts of the Jurassic Coast to take a look at. And so I'm just going to show you some quick images of various parts of the Jurassic Coast. And that's an ammonite in the foreground. See how big that is? British names are so interesting, aren't they? So that's some pictures of what the Jurassic Coast looks like. And you're saying, well, why is he spending time on that? Well, as a geologist, it's like paradise because of this. Abundant fossils found in these rocks. Now, those people are looking for fossils, and the rule is you're allowed to keep the fossils you find unless they are so unique and so large that they have to be placed into a museum of some sort. This is called a pyrite ammonite. It's made of FeS2 iron pyrite. That's a dolomite. And that's an ammonite. And so how cool would it be to be walking along the beach and picking up pieces like that? So I call these the ABCs of the Jurassic Coast: ammonites, dolomite, and crinoids. Imagine finding that. Sorry. That would make your day, wouldn't it? Now, this region, Lyme Regis, is famous. And if you've read any of Bill Bryson's books, you'll know what an interesting author he is. He came up with a book called A Short History of Nearly Everything. And this is from chapter 8. By this time, 1812, however, paleontological momentum had moved to England. In 1812, at Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast, an extraordinary child named Mary Anning, age 11, 12, or 13, depending on whose account you read, found a strange fossilized sea monster 17 feet long, known as Ichthyosaurus. It was embedded in the steep and dangerous cliffs along the English Channel. So here we have a 12-year-old girl. It was the start of a remarkable career. Anning would spend the next 35 years gathering fossils, which she sold to tourists, and that's because they lived in poverty. Her parents had died, and she had to do something to make a living. She is commonly held to be the source for the famous tongue twister. She would also find the first plesiosaurus and the first and best of the pterodactyls. Though none of these was technically a dinosaur, that wasn't terribly relevant at the time, since nobody then knew what a dinosaur was anyway. It was enough to realize that the world had once held creatures strikingly unlike anything that we now may find. Her name was Mary Anning, and she's now very revered and famous throughout all of England, and rightly so. She died at the age of 47 from cancer, and she had been at the time well respected by paleontologists and geologists all around the world who came to her and learned from this young woman who did everything on her own and learned everything on her own. But there's the rock from which she started to extract her fossils. And that was her first Ichthyosaurus. When she was 12 years old, she extracted that 17-foot long Ichthyosaurus. Isn't that remarkable? And that's what they look like, perhaps. And then this was her plesiosaurus. She extracted that about 4 or 5 years later. And that's what plesiosaurus looks like. And so these fossils are coming out of a series of sedimentary rocks that were accumulated over time during the Jurassic time period. And so there's your Jurassic time period here, relative to the Triassic and the Cretaceous. And that's a geological time scale. Anyway, this is a recreation of what the seas might have looked like at the time. And so fossils are evidence of pre-existing life, and this is the type of thing that one has found in the cliffs of the Jurassic coast. Pretty fascinating, isn't it? And that's why people in the thousands go out, and one of the interesting hobbies that they have is collecting fossils along the coast, the Jurassic coast, the south coast of England. So that's my hope. I'd love to find some, and if you happen to be there, I hope you can find some of those as well. This one's a little bit too big to put in one's backpack. But amazing to think it's just sitting there on the shore. Back home, this would be boarded all off, and you'd have signs pointing to what it was, do not cross, but here you just go up and check it out. So indeed, a very famous area, Lyme Regis along the Dorset coast. And this picture here, which has been falsely used as a representation of the White Cliffs of Dover, is actually from the shores of the Jurassic coast. This is called the Seven Sisters. And a lot of publications have falsely used pictures of the Jurassic coast for their advertising for the White Cliffs of Dover. So anyway, there are two regions, and we're going to be visiting both of those regions. So there's the Jurassic coast, and now we put back to the White Cliffs of Dover. And the White Cliffs of Dover contain some fossils as well. They're not as big, they're not as prolific, they're not as amazing, but nonetheless, they're still impressive. This is a chalk ammonite made not of iron pyrite, but instead of chalk. And then we have other types of little fossils as well. And the Sternotaxis, for instance, is about the size of your hand. Now, there was a little bit of concern about the dirtying of the White Cliffs of Dover, because as you know, pollution can sometimes cling to surfaces, and that has happened here as well. And so a group of volunteers, numbering over 400, decided that they would do something about the appearance of the White Cliffs of Dover. So this is what they did: 250,000 gallons of white paint, 5,800 brushes, rollers and brushes. And in 2016, of course, this is what was found on the front page of the papers of London. For those of you who can't see it, Friday, April the 1st. Sorry, I had to do it. I just had to throw it in. Anyway, when you get off the boat, you might not choose to go for a hike along the cliffs, but you might choose to go to Dover Castle. And if not, you can at least walk around it, because it is very formidable. Henry II spent a lot of his money building this and constructing this amazing castle. But again, the whole idea here was defense. This great castle on top of these great cliffs presented an obstacle that no foreign empire would try and conquer, or at least that was the hope. And so truly it's a stunning location. And there's the dining room. So these cliffs have historically represented a barrier protecting England from invading forces. The Romans saw those cliffs. Julius Caesar said, no, you cannot conquer that. Napoleon from France, the same thing, could not conquer England because of these imposing cliffs. Germany had to fly over them, would not dare attack them from the waters. And so historically they have been a defense symbol of hope and encouragement for Britain. When you go to Normandy and you see the White Cliffs of Dover, if you are British, that is home. It's a welcoming sight, especially in May, June of 1940 during the evacuation of Dunkirk. And so you can just imagine how these soldiers being rescued, being towed across the Straits of Dover in these little boats felt when they saw the beautiful, welcoming cliffs, the white cliffs, the beautiful cliffs of home. I will never forget the people I met braving those angry skies. I remember well, as the shadows fell, the light of hope in their eyes. And though I'm far away, I still can hear them say, thumbs up, for when the dawn comes up.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, when the world is free, the shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. Everyone, there'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow, when the world is free. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us at the main stage. As we'll now start to set up for the next performance, please make your way to the exit.
Sini, betul.
You're welcome. Hi, Jones. There he is.